Sånn.
Okay, tusen takk. Okay, thank you. As Jan mentioned, in a few weeks, the Working Group 2 report on impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation will be released in Yokohama, Japan. And this is really an exciting report for anybody who's interested in climate change, so what? The report will look at what climate change means for ecosystems and society, what are the observed impacts of climate change, what's projected to happen under different scenarios of climate change, and what are the implications for oceans, cities, food systems, human security, poverty, and so on. How can humans and other species adapt to these changes, and what are the limits to adaptation and effective responses? What are the implications for different regions of the world? And finally, what are the prospects for climate-resilient pathways for sustainable development? And these questions are going to be addressed in 30 chapters, and Asun St. Clair will explain more about exactly what's in the report. What I want to do now is just to step back for a second and look at what the content, what might be presented in the report based on decades of research on climate impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation. So if we look at what types of patterns are emerging, we can start to see that, yes, we're starting to see the implications, not just of all the little data points and facts, but we're starting to see some trends emerging. And it is the identification of these broader patterns and trends that are key to understanding the future in a changing climate, including the significance of the human responses that we make today, tomorrow, and in the future. So from the first assessment report that was published in 1990 to the fourth assessment report that came out in 2007, and including the research that has been published in between, we can start to see 7 broad patterns that I'll discuss. The first pattern is that more and more observed impacts of climate change are being documented, both for nature and society. And these are not just related to climate change extremes, but also to gradual changes, such as the melting of glaciers, melting of permafrost, changes in species distributions, and also earlier springs or warmer winters, as we're seeing here. How do we know that these observed changes are related to climate change rather than part of natural variability? And this is where the science of detection and attribution come in, which is looking at the statistical likelihood of these occurring without human influence. And here I think it's important to recognize that climate change, the way we're studying it, is a process, not an event. So it's really a statistical average of different events, and we're trying to sort out what might happen in a normal without our impacts versus what we are influencing. And we're starting to see that there are fingerprints of human influence on many of these types of impacts. So the fifth assessment report assesses the knowledge to date on what these impacts are and where they're happening, and also who is affected. The second pattern that we see is that the impacts are not distributed evenly across society. Some groups, regions, sectors, or countries are experiencing negative impacts of already what is, as Jan mentioned, the documented increase of temperatures of about 0.85 degrees Celsius since 1880. Other people are not really experiencing impacts yet, or not noticing them or perceiving them. And this is where it becomes interesting, because the definition of dangerous climate change really depends on who you are, where you are, and how you can cope with and adapt to multiple shocks and multiple stressors. I was in El Salvador a few years back, and the head of an NGO said to me, "Karen, we are not adapting to climate change. We are not coping with climate change. We are surviving." And I think that's really an important part, that we understand that climate change is not the only change taking place in the world today, but we do know that something like a drought can make it harder to adapt, to recover from an economic crisis. So the fifth assessment report, or AR5 as we call it, will look at these distributional effects, including the implications for human security, poverty, and livelihoods. The third pattern or trend that we see emerging through the research is that the impacts are not distributed linearly over time. What we're seeing is that the greater the warming, the greater the risks. The impacts of going from a 1 degree to 2 degree warmer world is not the same as going from 3 degree and 4 degree, partly because this is a systemic change. And what we see is that there are new linkages, new feedbacks that are showing up all the time as temperature increases and as oceans warm. So this little diagram just shows some of the things that in terms of ecosystems and their impacts As rivers warm, more water evaporates, some species thrive and others do not. And then there's also a greater human demand for water. 20 years ago, most researchers actually thought that we would, or I guess I speak for myself personally, thought that the impacts would be kind of gradually emerging over time. And I didn't think in my lifetime I would actually see any types of impacts except in the statistics. And I think we're seeing now that that is not the right way to think about the issue, especially if we look in the Arctic. So the AR5 report will explore how impacts evolve according to different emissions scenarios of climate change. The fourth trend we're seeing is that adaptation is becoming increasingly important as the impacts of climate change become more visible. Very few researchers and decision makers were talking about adaptation in the 1990s. And in fact, it was almost taboo to be talking about that instead of mitigation. But now it's receiving attention at every level and within most sectors of society. There are still a lot of questions about adaptation, including about the technical aspects, adapting to what and how, but also about adaptation as a social process. Who decides, when, and who pays? There are also uncertainties about the limits to adaptation. At what point will we have to face losses, and how is this going to matter in terms of the implications for our economy and our culture? And we see that here with, we feel with a rainy winter in Oslo, that we start to recognize that there are these impacts of climate change that we may have to adapt to that will mean losses. So there are lots of different aspects at stake here, and the AR5 report will assess the current understanding of adaptation, adaptive capacity, as well as the constraints, limits, and costs of adaptation. This brings me to the costs. And the costs of climate change impacts and adaptation are emerging as an issue that it's uncertain, but we know it's not trivial. Attempts have been made to estimate the costs of impacts and adaptation as a percentage of GDP, but it's very, there's a degrees of magnitude in what the estimates are, but we see nevertheless that the economic and human costs are actually increasing, often because more people and more assets are exposed to climate change. So it's hard to come up with a number of how much climate impacts cost, and this is a problem because we like numbers. But some of the impacts and costs are not tangible. These are the experiences, the opportunities, the places that we actually consider priceless. So whether we're talking about glaciers, islands, or deltas, there are things that we value that are at risk. The fifth assessment report then will discuss these different valuation methods in recognition that just cost-benefit approaches alone are not sufficient. Sixth, the consequences of climate change are both local and global, with the effects spreading through production, trade, migration, financial markets, and travel. And we start to see 15 years ago, 20 years ago, everyone was doing these country studies on impacts and adaptation to really know what does this mean for this place. But in a globalized world, we see that the impacts in faraway places have widespread consequences. Production chains are distributed across the globe. And I was just looking, a report came out from the Norwegian oil fund or pension fund, and it shows that we are actually investing our wealth around the world in many different countries, also increasingly in real estate. And we start to see that, yes, there are actually, investors are looking at what the impacts of climate change. So because the pension fund is invested in the American Water Company that operates in California, drought in California influences us as well. So the fifth assessment report has includes 10 chapters that highlight the regional consequences of climate change, for example, for Europe and Asia, so that we can start to understand these connections and put the big picture together. And finally, the last pattern that we've learned over the past decade is that choices and decisions made today are important. The decisions that were made in the past have had a strong influence on how the types of impacts we're experiencing today. So what we decide not to do, or what we decide to do, what we decide not to invest in, and what we decide to invest in, actually influences development, mitigation, sustainability, adaptation, disaster risk management, all these concepts that Asun will point out are discussed in the fifth assessment report. So in other words, the choices and decisions we make today will influence the type of world that we're going to get in 50 years. And we know that more and more. So the fifth assessment report, to conclude, will provide information that can help us make decisions today, putting us on a path towards a climate resilient pathway. And I think that these types of trends, Asun will talk about in in detail for the report. One of the other trends, though, that I think is very, very positive is that over the last years we see that interest in climate research and the engagement with the climate issue is also increasing substantially. So on a very positive note, that won't be included in the 5th assessment report, but I think it's the most promising news that we can have about climate impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation. So thank you, and I'll pass on to Asun.